Good morning. So, today's topic is major trends in film theory. So, because of the relative newness of the film medium compared with other art forms, Thomas Edison's kinetoscope peephole machines were first opened to the public in New York City only in 1894. We are looking at the beginnings of film theory and how this new medium called cinema started. We have also referred to Thomas Edison's and his invention kinetoscope peephole, okay, which is one of the earliest modes of the moving pictures. We are talking about the year 1894 and how it all began. We are also talking about the Lumiere brothers, who first projected their short actualities to a paying audience who paid money to watch films in a cafe in Paris in 1895. So, film theory and criticism are dependent on a limited number of major texts, and the lines of their discourse can easily be traced up to the point when the so called theory of structuralism and post structuralism had their profound effect on cultural history in general. From that point on, film theory and criticism proliferated at a very rapid rate, at a very rapid speed, and film journals became as much a place for discussion, debates, arguments on the issues of art and aesthetics as the journals were for essays on literature. So, film, in other words, acquired the status which was earlier accorded only to great works of literature, and film journals and film historians played a major role in according this status to film studies. Much of the discourse on cinema from the start is concerned with fictional narrative films, an emphasis that parallels that the vast popularity of such works compared with the more limited and specialized appeal of the documentary and more experimental and avant-garde film. Most of the early theoreticians show a clear leaning, gravitation toward the formalist possibilities of cinema, and certain formalism and certain aspects of formalism definitely underpin the montage theory expounded by the great Russian filmmakers in the 1920s. For example, Leo Kuleshov or Lev Kuleshov from Russia, who began to publish essays in 1917 and many books published in the 1920s. They talk about the practice of American filmmakers, especially filmmakers such as D.W. Griffiths, and Kuleshov started to understand the practice of filmmaking by the great filmmakers of that time. So, there is a term called the Kuleshov effect. It has passed into cinematic language to describe what for Kuleshov was the inherent magic of the film medium itself, that is, which is the creation of meaning, significance and emotional impact by relating and juxtaposing individual shots. See, we are talking about montage theory, one of the earliest efforts to lend a kind of intellectual touch to film studies. The idea was that how scenes are created by relating and juxtaposing individual shots, how meanings are created by juxtaposing individual shots, resulting in a context that was not inherent in any of the single pieces of film, but was a product of the ending itself. So, Kuleshev's student Pudovkin began writing two books, two manuscripts that together were to become the book Film Technique, when he was working on his picture Mother. You know, Mother as authored by Maxim Gorky. So, when the movie was being picturized, when the movie was filmed in 1920s, Pudovkin started writing two books on film studies. So, in this book he explores his own variation of montage, what Sergei Eisenstein referred to as linkage, in which shots are unobtrusively linked together so that they continuously and naturally flow along with the film's narrative line. So, this is a contribution of Kuleshov. But he also pushes theoretical discourse further with his discussion of filmic space and time. Now, we are talking about temporal spatial aspects of cinema, and Kuleshev's discussion of dimensions created by the editing process itself and distinct from any space and time known in external reality. So, these are the contributions made by Kuleshev and Pudovkin. So, apart from Pudovkin's concept of linkage editing, there is Eisenstein's collision theory of montage, in which the dramatic juxtaposition of shots produces a kind of attraction to one another that makes the significance or meaning of their synthesis more clear to the viewer. Whereas Kuleshev had demonstrated how two juxtaposed shots could create or produce context not inherent in the individual images. Eisenstein went beyond his mentor in both his writings and also in his films to show that the two images could be actually synthesized in the mind of the viewer to create a single totality and perception, even to create a level of thought or cognition beyond the realistic images. In the now coming to another key theorist, Andre Bazin. So, in the essays of Andre Bazin written in France in the late 1940s and the 50s, the great book is called What is Cinema, Volume 1 and Volume 2. So, we have an impressive blend of realism and discussion of realist criticism and theory of realism. Is cinema actually realistic? Can it be realistic? That is the discussion, that is the debate all about. So, Bazin found Kuleshev's and Eisenstein's emphasis on montage antithetical to the realistic possibilities of cinema, creating instead an illusion of reality that is a product of the interaction of the shots and not a reflection of the world which is actually filmed or photographed. Bazin praised the American directors such as Orson Welles and William Wyler for emphasizing the individual image itself and what each reveals of reality, not exactly through relationship of images. So, an emphasis largely absent in cinema since the silent films of earlier filmmakers, earlier Hollywood filmmakers. Now, through the techniques of deep focus and long take, according to Bazin, Orson Welles and William Wyler present space and time as continuous and whole as they appear in external reality, so that viewers are forced to immerse themselves in the images and select for themselves what to see. Famous scene from Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, where while the mother signs the document of the child coming into inheritance, the child is happily shown playing away, and we watch that the child playing away through the window pane. Okay, but this was called the deep focus technique, where all characters are extremely and very clearly visible to the viewers, and it it depends on the viewers what to select, unlike the montage. So, one of the founders of the French film journal Cahiers du Cinéma, Bazin, influenced the criticism of people like Godard and Francois Truffaut and Chabrol and people like Jacques Rivette, who wrote for the journal, and subsequently they also became extremely influential members of the entire French New Wave cinema. Bazin's emphasis on the individual image, his analysis of the single motion picture in the context of film genre, and his appreciation of the personal and the unique in the achievement of each film artist also had an impact on the new wave films these critics were to direct. But it is basically Bazin's shrewd and very insightful appreciation of cinema and his ability to respond to the nuances of each work, and his very discerning eye for style and form, and the use of details and techniques as the source for his concepts that have survived as a model for future writers of film appreciation and film criticism. I would like to draw your attention to a passage from André Bazin's What is Cinema? I will read out this quote for you. If the plastic arts were put under psychoanalysis, the practice of embalming the dead might turn out to be a fundamental factor in their creation. The process might reveal that at the origin of painting and sculpture, there lies a mummy complex. The religion of ancient Egypt aimed against death, saw survival as depending on the continued existence of the corporeal body. Thus, by providing a defense against the passage of time, it satisfied a basic psychological need in man, for death is but the victory of time. To preserve artificially his bodily appearance is to snatch it from the flow of time, to stow it away neatly, so to speak, in the hold of life. It was natural, therefore, to keep up appearances in the face of the reality of death by preserving flesh and bone. The first Egyptian statue then was a mummy tanned and petrified in sodium, but pyramids and labyrinthine corridors offered no certain guarantee against ultimate pillage. And look what cinema did to this. So, along with Bazin, there is another important name, Siegfried Kracauer, who is also recognized as one of the major advocates of realist cinema. He wrote a famous theoretical text called Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality, which was published in 1960. And the direction he takes is that the fictional films that most fulfill the potential of the filmic medium are those that least distort or remove the audience from the world as we know it, but those films also have the capacity to make us rediscover the real world, to expand our vision of it. Now, coming to something called genre theory and criticism, which made considerable strides during the same period of time, and which seeks to recognize the very popular nature of film, especially as a product of the Hollywood studio system. Although individual directors might be cited for their abilities in certain genres and creating their or inscribing their personal stamp within the tradition, much genre theory and criticism was based on the connection between the works and their audiences, and attempted to explain the social and cultural needs of the viewer. So, genre theory and criticism was itself the most probable or rather most profitable, probably most profitable location for adopting the new emphasis on structuralism, which was having such a deep impact on cultural criticism during the 60s and the 70s. So, Hollywood offered a large number of similar films with very well known elements in each genre, which made these works the inevitable source for studies in cinema and structuralist approach to cinema. Now, the binary oppositions and structures exploded in these studies, and they may seem too superficial to suggest that deep structures that people like for instance Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great anthropologist, had proposed in myths from primitive cultures or in his treatment of the Oedipus myth. But then there is a work called Horizon West, written by someone called Jim Kitces in 1969, and where the writer is able to establish a basic structural and thematic kind of a construct in the Western genre, and also show the individual contributions of specific directors within this context. Then there is another great theorist, Peter Wallin, and his discussions of Hollywood directors Howard Hawks and John Ford in Wallin's extremely influential book. Those of you who are interested in doing some kind of research in film studies should know this book. It is called Signs and Meanings in the Cinema, published in 1969, and he also, Peter Wallin also uses genre in auteur structuralist approach to develop thematic structures and tensions in the films of John Ford and Howard Hawks. The most important early work in the context of semiotics was by Christian Metz, and his book Film Language, A Semiotics of Cinema, which was originally published in the French language. Now, Metz's major theory is to demonstrate the way in which films signify meaning through semiotic codes, especially specialized codes unique to the cinema, such as the arrangements of shots possible in a narrative sequence. There is also something called second semiotics, and where the main idea of the second semiotics is to identify and then explore the ideological structures and codes of capitalist society evident or even implied in commercial narrative cinema, and to tie the ideological focus in with Jacques Lacan's psychoanalytic theory about the child's early developmental stages, especially in the mirror stage, to which we regress on some level when viewing the images on the screen recreated within us in the imaginary, and where a feeling of oneness and self, which is first developed in us when we view our reflections in a mirror during our early childhood, but now is actually developed by a film's ideology. So, using Jacques Lacan's mirror stage theory and applying it to cinema. Now, there is another important film theorist, Jean-Louis Baudry, who wrote Effect or Ideological Effects of the Basic Cinematic Apparatuses. This was the first of several essays on the subject that were to influence Christian Metz to further his further development and to popularize these ideas in the texts that he wrote between 1973 and 1975. Collectively, they are called the imaginary signifier. Now, coming back to Jacques Lacan, his concept of suture, you know what is a suture? To stitch up something. So, he gives us the concept of suture, which film makers and film critics also, or film theorists also apply. So, his concept of suture earlier introduced to film theory in Audat's essay La Suture. Okay, so, Jean-Pierre Audat. This concept appears in the essay La Suture, and it offers much debate on the recreation of the imaginary and how the subject is positioned on the screen, and how we impose unity on such techniques of narrative films as point of view editing. So, whose point of view are we supposed to follow? So, we have to understand these theories of suture, of mirror stage, and points of view, match cutting and eye line matching, and on the way how such techniques impose unity and perhaps give us subjectivity. How, you know, there is a concept of camera subjectivity, subjectivism. So, how these things operate. Now, from here we move on to feminist film theory and criticism, which was also a major trend, which is still a major trend in understanding and appreciating films. So, feminist film theory and criticism has also been a vigorous and influential school, and it has had great impact on the teaching of the film studies. So, early texts in this area offer a straightforward critical approach in which the various stereotypes of women in film are traced and analyzed as products of patriarchal society and culture, but feminist criticism has also become very much involved with the ideas of Louis Althusser and Jacques Lacan and semiotic approaches of post-structuralist film theory in its attempt to understand sexual differentiation within the narrative and textual codes of the film as well as within the viewing process itself. Now, one of the major essays of this school comes by Laura Mulvey, whose essay Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, published in 1975, describes the images of women in the Hollywood cinema as the passive object for the active male gaze. So, these concepts like gaze and objectification of women, okay, so you can trace all these back to the great feminist writers of this age, and Laura Mulvey is one of the most influential theorists of this trend. So, the idea is that the pleasure of the male gaze is threatened by the woman's representation as a signifier of castration. Mulvey describes two unconscious responses of the male to alleviate his fear of castration. The first of a process of sadistic voyeurism which denigrates the woman, and the second a process of scopophilia and fetishizing women, which overvalue the woman's physical appearance. In response to this focus on male pleasure and desire, Mulvey herself, in Afterthoughts on Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, which is inspired by Duel in the Sun. It is a movie directed by King Vidor, and Mulvey wrote this essay on visual pleasure and narrative cinema on King Vidor's Duel in the Sun. And also there is another critic called Kaya Silverman, who wrote Disembodying in the Female Voice, published in 1984. There was another film feminist critic, film feminist, Mary Ann Doan, who in her essay Film and the Masquerade, theorizing the female spectator, all these theorists, Silverman and Mulvey and Mary Ann Doan, they all consider from a psychoanalytic perspective the pressures and problems brought upon the female viewer by films structured for the male gaze and forbidding any positive identification with the female characters. So, one response to the psychoanalytic Marxist approach has been a greater emphasis on film form and technique, and the response is noted for its reliance on literary concepts and the examination of what takes place on the screen in the context of the viewer's reaction. Okay, so, now let us talk about another trend, which is narratology, that includes an important dose of viewer responses analysis. The important theorist of this movement is he is not exactly a film theorist, but a narratologist, Edward Brannigan, and he writes in his work a point of view in the cinema, a theory of narration and subjectivity in classical film, which often uses the vocabulary and concepts of literary narratology to discuss filmic narrative texts, but does so to achieve a detailed analysis of the way film techniques create various types of subjectivity on the screen and subjective responses in the viewer. Now, since the 1960s have been the concepts and studies of postmodernism, the term itself has been definitely it has been defined quite differently or variably, but persistent elements are the denial of any meaningful theories concerning life, reality or art, fragmentation, lack of cohesion in both cultural and individual identity. So, those are the major features of postmodernism. Again, the subversion of time and history and the domination of the world by media and information technology, which we have created and where we have created a reality of science and images for ourselves. So, most significant in this discussion has been Guy Debord's seminal The Society of the Spectacle and also the works by Jean Baudrillard, especially the Simulations, which was published in 1983, and then again a very seminal text I can emphasize for those who are interested in research in cinema and film studies. This author is very important, Frederick Jameson, and his Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of the Late Capitalism. So, the concepts of postmodernism have been useful so far in the analysis of a number of films and in understanding certain tendencies in modern cinema. So, we have to understand Jameson's concept, pastiche, the imitation and accumulation of the filmic codes of the past. It has been especially useful, and this shift was precipitated most notably by a short influential essay by Alexandre Astrou published in La Camera Estilo. Okay, it was called The Birth of a New Avant-Garde, La Camera Estilo, published in 1968. So, what came to be known as the auteur theory was later imported to North America in the 1960s via the critical writings of Andrew Sarris and his reappraisal of Hollywood cinema, which now coming to post-colonial theories. So, an important demonstration of the relation between post-colonial studies and film theory is demonstrated by the works of Frantz Fanon, whose ideas including discussions of film spectatorship and issues of race in his works called Black Skin, White Mask, published in 1952. And again we have works like in Unthinking, Eurocentrism, Multiculturalism and the Media by Ella Shohat and Robert Stem, where these writers argue that Eurocentrism envisions the world from a single privileged point. Again, there is a book, Mystifying Movies, Fads and Fallacies in Contemporary Film Theory and Philosophical Problems of Classical Film Theory. The great writer Noel Carroll defines theory strictly as a coherent and axiomatic set of statements that can both explain events and foresee them. Then Carroll uses the definition to justify the critique of much of the film theory canon, preferring a model analytic theory from philosophy as the basis of his work, including theorizing the moving images and a philosophy of mass art. Carroll is among a significant cluster of film theoreticians who are antagonists to the dominance of what is frequently called slap theory in cinema studies, which is based on the theories of Saussure, Lacan, Althusser and Barthes. So, therefore, you get the term slab. So, Carroll credited with David Bordwell came up with a co-edited volume called Post Theory Reconstructing Film Studies, where various authors critique the grand theories that had come to dominate cinema studies through the 1960s and 70s, most of which include semiotics and cultural and psychoanalytic studies. So, Bordwell in his book or in his essay rather, Contemporary Film Studies, attempts to map out the incoherence and trendiness and general lack of solid intellectual grounding of much recent theory. Bordwell's approach provides a template for analyzing the form in which events in a film are presented, including plot, sujet and story, which is also called fabula, while cognitivism addresses the cinematic representation in the mental activities of the spectators. So, let me draw your attention to some of the selected readings here. Please take a look at the bibliography. There is a book by Dudley Andrew, Andre Bazin, The Art of Watching Films by Joseph Boggs, Leo Brody, Film Theory and Criticism. This is a very important text. David Cook's A History of Narrative Films, Pam Cook's The Cinema Book, and of course, you have Deluge's Cinema 1 and Cinema 2. Thank you very much.